In the hushed corners of eastern Kentucky, where the hills roll like sleeping giants and the trees whisper secrets to the wind, Alara Voss pulled her old pickup truck onto a gravel road so narrow it barely fit 2 tires side by side. Dust swirled behind her like a ghost trailing her every move. She hadn't slept much the night before, not because she was nervous exactly, but because something inside her had finally snapped. After 7 years of bouncing between overpriced studio apartments in cities that never felt like home, after watching her savings shrink with every rent hike and coffee run, she'd woken up one gray morning and typed 3 words into a browser. Cheap land, Kentucky. What popped up wasn't land. It was a listing so strange it made her laugh out loud. Tiny home for sale, $500, as is no questions asked. The photo showed a crooked little A-frame cabin, its green paint blistered by sun and rain, propped up on cinder blocks like it was holding its breath. There was no porch, no mailbox, not even a proper driveway, just a patch of dirt and a rusted chain-link fence sagging into the weeds. Most people would have scrolled past without a second thought. But Alara wasn't most people. She'd spent years drawing imaginary worlds for children's books, filling pages with hidden doors, secret gardens, and forgotten treasures. Maybe that's why this place called to her, not as a house, but as a story waiting to be lived. She called the number listed. An old man answered on the 3rd ring, his voice rough like gravel under boots. "You the one about the cabin?" he asked. No hello, no small talk. She said yes. He gave her directions, past the hollow where the creek forks, turn left at the dead oak with the tire swing, and told her to bring cash. $500 exact, and don't bring no inspector. Place is what it is. She didn't ask why it was so cheap. She didn't ask if it had electricity or running water. She just packed a duffel bag, borrowed her cousin's truck, and drove 8 hours through winding back roads, her heart thumping like a drum in her chest. When she finally saw it in person, standing alone in a sea of goldenrod and wild blackberry vines, it looked even smaller than in the photos. The roof sagged slightly in the middle and one window was boarded up with plywood. But the air smelled clean, like pine needles and damp earth, and the silence was so deep it felt like a blanket wrapping around her shoulders. She took a breath and knocked on the door, though she wasn't sure anyone would answer. The man who opened it was tall and thin, with hands like knotted rope and eyes that had seen too many winters. He introduced himself as Otis Claymore. He didn't smile, but he didn't seem unfriendly either, just tired like the land itself. He stepped aside without a word and let her walk through the front door. Inside, time had slowed to a crawl. Dust floated in sunbeams that cut through cracks in the walls. The floor was bare wood, worn smooth in places, groaning softly underfoot. There was a stone fireplace with soot still clinging to its edges, a single metal cot in the corner, and shelves built into the walls, empty now, but shaped as if they'd once held books or jars of preserves. No kitchen, no bathroom. Just 4 walls, a roof, and the quiet hum of the forest outside. "It's yours if you want it," Otis said, leaning against the doorframe. $500 cash. Alara didn't hesitate. She counted out the bills from her emergency stash, the last of what she'd saved from a freelance gig that barely covered groceries, and handed them over. Otis tucked the money into his shirt pocket without counting it. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a key tied to a piece of twine. It was rusted, bent at one end, but solid in her palm. "Place has secrets," he said, his voice low, "but they ain't mine to tell." Before she could ask what he meant, he turned and walked down the path toward a beat-up sedan parked at the edge of the property. He didn't look back. Within minutes, his taillights disappeared around a bend in the road, leaving Alara alone with her new $500 home and 1,000 questions spinning in her head. That first night, she slept on the metal cot with her jacket as a pillow, and her sketchbook clutched to her chest like a shield. The wind picked up after sunset, rattling the loose boards and making the trees sway like dancers in the dark. She listened to every creak and sigh of the cabin, half expecting something or someone to appear. But nothing did. Just the steady rhythm of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Still, as she drifted in and out of sleep, she heard something else. A soft metallic rattle, not loud, not constant, just a faint clink like a loose coin rolling under a floorboard. She sat up, heart pounding, and pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. She told herself it was the wind, or maybe a mouse, but the sound didn't come again. Over the next few days, Alara got to work. She wasn't a builder, not really, But she'd grown up fixing things, sewing torn clothes, patching bike tires, rewiring lamps with YouTube tutorials. She started small, sweeping out decades of dust, hauling buckets of water from a clear spring half a mile down the hill, patching holes in the roof with tar paper and scrap wood. She strung up solar-powered fairy lights she'd bought at a gas station, and they cast a warm golden glow over the room at night. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She began to notice things. The way the morning sun hit the east wall just right, turning the dust into glitter. The way rain sounded different on the tin roof than it did in the city, softer, more musical. The way the floor dipped slightly near the fireplace, as if something heavy had once sat there for a long time. One afternoon, while trying to level a wobbly table leg with a folded piece of cardboard, she noticed a floorboard near the cot that didn't sit flush with the others. It stuck up just a hair, enough to catch her toe if she wasn't careful. She knelt down and ran her fingers along the edge. The wood was dry and splintered, but something about it felt off, like it had been pried up before and never quite settled back into place. Curious, she grabbed a flathead screwdriver from her toolbox and gently worked it into the crack. The board lifted with surprising ease, revealing a dark space beneath. Her breath caught. She expected dirt, maybe a nest of old leaves or a family of field mice, but instead she saw the corner of something metal, smooth, cool to the touch, and definitely man-made. Her hands shook as she pulled the board all the way up. Underneath lay a rectangular metal box about the size of a shoebox, covered in rust but still sealed tight. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked, and when she shook it gently, she heard that same soft rattle from her first night. She sat back on her heels, staring at it. This wasn't just junk. Someone had hidden this here, on purpose, carefully, and Otis had known. That's what he meant by secrets, but she didn't open it right away. Something in her gut told her to wait, to think. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a responsibility. So she placed the board back over the hole, covered it with her duffel bag, and went outside to chop firewood, her mind racing. Who had lived here before? Why hide something valuable in a place worth only $500? And why leave it behind? She spent the evening sketching by lantern light, trying to calm her nerves, but her pencil kept drifting toward the floor, drawing imaginary boxes, hidden compartments, maps leading to forgotten things. She thought about Lillian Crow, the name she'd seen on an old property deed tucked in the back of a drawer, but she didn't know enough yet to connect the dots. What she did know was this. Her life had just tilted on its axis. That box under the floor wasn't just metal and mystery. It was a door, and whether she liked it or not, she was standing in front of it, key in hand. The next morning, she woke with a plan. She'd take the box to town, just to look, just to see what it was. Not to sell, not to show off, just to understand. She wrapped it in an old flannel shirt, tucked it into her backpack, and walked the 2 miles to the nearest paved road, where a neighbor had promised to give her a ride to the county seat. As she walked, the sun rose over the hills, painting the sky in streaks of peach and lavender. Birds called to each other in the treetops. The air smelled like wet grass and wild mint. For the first time in years, Alara didn't feel lost. She felt found, like she'd stumbled into the first chapter of a story she was meant to live, not just draw. And somewhere beneath her feet in the quiet dark of that tiny cabin, the past waited patiently to be heard. Rain fell softly on the tin roof the morning Alara finally decided to open the box. It wasn't a storm, just a gentle, steady drizzle that turned the dirt path into mud and made the forest smell like wet bark and old secrets. She'd waited 3 days. 3 days of pacing the cabin, of staring at the floorboard, of rehearsing a dozen different scenarios in her head. What if it was dangerous? What if it was nothing? What if it changed everything? She knelt in the center of the room, the box resting on a folded blanket in front of her. Her hands were clean, her breath slow. She'd even lit a small candle, not for light, but for calm. The metal was cold, rough with rust, but the latch was surprisingly intact. It clicked open with a soft, reluctant sigh, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, the first thing she saw was paper, yellowed, brittle, folded carefully into thirds. Beneath it lay a tarnished pocket watch, its glass face cracked but the hand still frozen at 3:17. And then, at the very bottom, wrapped in faded velvet the color of dried blood, was a small pouch tied with twine. Her fingers trembled as she untied the knot. The fabric fell open and a dozen stones tumbled into her palm. They weren't like the smooth, polished gems she'd seen in jewelry stores. These were raw, jagged, uncut, glowing with inner fire even in the dim light. Deep blues like midnight ocean, fiery reds like embers, greens that shimmered like forest pools. They felt heavy, dense, alive in a way she couldn't explain. She sat back, stunned. This wasn't costume jewelry. This wasn't river rocks painted to look fancy. These were real, and they were valuable. She didn't need an expert to tell her that. But she needed one anyway. The nearest town was 20 miles away, a sleepy place called Harlow with one gas station, a post office, and a hardware store that also sold coffee and gossip. Ilara tucked the stones back into the pouch, wrapped the whole box in a waterproof tarp, and slung it over her shoulder. She walked to the road and flagged down Mrs. Darnell, the retired schoolteacher who drove into town every Tuesday for groceries. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Honey," Mrs. Darnell said, eyeing the bundle as Ilara climbed into the passenger seat. "Just found something odd in the cabin," Ilara replied, keeping her voice light. "Thought I'd get a second opinion." Mrs. Darnell nodded knowingly. "Otis's place, huh? That old cabin's got more stories than teeth in my grandma's jar." At the edge of town, Ilara asked to be dropped off at a small shop with a hand-painted sign, "Harlow Jewelers and Watch Repair, Eastern 1932. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The air smelled of polish and old wood. Behind the counter stood a man in his 60s with thick glasses and ink-stained fingers. His name tag read Walter. She didn't say much at first. Just asked if he could take a look at some old family stones. She pulled out one blue gem, the smallest, and placed it on the velvet pad he slid across the counter. Walter picked it up with tweezers, then peered through his loupe. He didn't speak for a full minute. Then he set it down slowly, removed his glasses, and looked at her like she'd just handed him a piece of the moon. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice low. "I found it," she said carefully, "in an old box." He nodded as if that explained everything and nothing. "This is a cashmere sapphire. Uncut, yes, but the color, the clarity, it's museum quality. And this?" He pointed to a red stone she'd left in the pouch. "That's a Burmese pigeon's blood ruby. Extremely rare, especially in this size." Ilara's throat went dry. How much would something like this be worth?" Walter leaned back, rubbing his chin. "If it were cut and certified? Easily 6 figures for just one. But these, they're untouched. That makes them even more valuable to collectors, historians, museums. You're holding a fortune in your hands, young lady." She left the shop in a daze. The rain had stopped, but the world felt heavier, brighter, stranger. A fortune. Millions, maybe, all hidden under a rotting floorboard in a $500 cabin. Back home, she spread everything out on her cot. The papers, the watch, the stones. She unfolded the brittle pages with care. The handwriting was elegant, looping, written in faded brown ink. It wasn't a letter. It was a list, names, dates, amounts, and beside each entry a tiny symbol, a bird, a key, a ship. One name stood out. Lillian Crow. Ilara's pulse quickened. She'd seen that name before, on the property deed tucked in the kitchen drawer. Lillian Crow, born 1898, died. Well, there was no death date. Just disappeared 1947. She spent the next 2 days researching. The county library had microfilm of old newspapers. She scrolled through grainy headlines until she found it. "Heiress vanishes after family empire crumbles." The article described how the Crow Mining Company, once one of the largest gem and mineral operations in the eastern U.S., collapsed amid lawsuits, fraud allegations, and whispers of stolen assets. Lillian, the only child, had inherited everything, then vanished without a trace. Some said she fled to Europe. Others claimed she died by her own hand. But no body was ever found. What if she didn't vanish? What if she just disappeared into plain sight? Ilara thought about the cabin, built in the late 1940s according to the land records. Simple, remote, perfect for someone who wanted to be forgotten. And the stones, were they part of the stolen assets? Or something else? She examined the pocket watch. On the back, engraved in tiny script, "For L with all my hope. En 1939. Who was he? A lover, a friend? That night she dreamed of a woman in a long coat standing in the rain, burying a box beneath floorboards, tears mixing with the downpour. When she woke, her cheeks were wet. The next morning she returned to Walter's shop. This time she brought the whole pouch. "I need to know more," she said. "Not just value, history, origin." Walter hesitated, then closed the shop early. He called a friend, a retired geologist who'd worked with gem archives in Washington. Together they examined the stones under magnification, comparing inclusions and color zones to known deposits. "These aren't just rare," the geologist said over speakerphone. "They're from specific mines that shut down in the 1930s. The Kashmir mine flooded in 1935. The Mogok Valley in Burma was closed during the war. These stones, they haven't been on the market in 80 years. Could they be linked to the Crow family?" Ilara asked. There was a long pause. The Crows didn't mine gems themselves, but they brokered them, imported, traded, and yes, there were rumors they held private reserves, stones too distinctive to sell openly, especially during the war. "Why would someone hide them?" Ilara whispered. "Maybe to protect them," Walter said gently, "or maybe to keep them out of the wrong hands." As she walked back to the truck, her mind raced. If Lillian hid these, she didn't do it for greed. She did it for safety. But from what? Back at the cabin, Ilara noticed something she'd missed before. One of the floor joists near the fireplace had faint carvings, tiny letters almost worn away. She brushed away decades of grime with a toothbrush and water. The letters spelled ER, not E. She flipped through the newspaper clippings again. And there it was. A footnote in a 1946 article. Eleanor Reeves, Lillian Crow's closest confidant and rumored romantic partner, last seen boarding a train to Cincinnati. Never arrived. Her breath caught. Eleanor. Suddenly the watch made sense. The list of names, were they people Lillian and Eleanor helped? The symbols, bird for freedom, key for safe passage, ship for escape? She remembered something Mrs. Darnell had mentioned weeks ago. Back in the war days, some folks around here ran a quiet line for folks in trouble. Jews, dissidents, folks the government didn't like. Never talked about it, just did it. Could Lillian have been part of that? The pieces began to click. The Crow fortune wasn't just money, it was a lifeline. And these stones? They weren't loot. They were a reserve. A final safety net hidden in case the world needed saving again. But then why leave them? Why not use them unless... Lillian never got the chance. Ilara sat by the fire that night, the stones spread out before her like stars. She thought about selling them. Just one could buy her a house, a car, security for life. She could disappear too, into comfort, into ease. But something stopped her. It wasn't fear. It was respect. These stones had a story, a purpose, and she'd been chosen by accident or fate to hear it. The next day she visited the county clerk's office. She asked about Otis Claymore's family. The clerk, a woman with silver braids and sharp eyes, flipped through old employment records. Otis's grandmother, Cora Claymore, worked as a housekeeper for the Crows in the 30s and 40s, she said. Lived on the estate. Left after Lillian disappeared. Moved out to the hills. Built that little cabin you're in now? Ilara's heart pounded. So Otis knew. Knew what? The clerk asked. That the cabin wasn't just a cabin. The clerk smiled faintly. Some families keep quiet not because they're hiding, but because they're honoring. That evening, Ilara walked to Otis's old farmhouse, half a mile down the ridge. She hadn't seen him since the day she bought the cabin, but maybe he'd left something behind. The house was empty, sold. But taped to the inside of the mailbox was a plain envelope. With her name on it, she opened it with shaking. Hands inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in shaky handwriting, Lillian didn't run. She stayed. She waited. She hoped. The stones aren't yours to sell. They're yours to understand. Oh, Ilara stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at the paper in her hands. She finally understood. This wasn't a treasure hunt. It was a trust, and just as she turned to leave, a sleek black car pulled up the driveway. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, holding a leather briefcase. "Miss Voss?" he said with a practiced smile. "My name is Daniel Reeves. I represent a private collector in Louisville. I heard you came into possession of some rare minerals. I'm prepared to offer you $2 million. Cash. Today." Ilara looked at him, then at the envelope in her hand, then back at the hills where Lillian had once walked. She smiled politely. "I'm not selling." His smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. $3 million then. before word gets out and the government steps in. She shook her head. They're not for sale. He lingered a moment too long, then got back in his car. As he drove off, Ilara knew this wasn't over. People like him didn't take no for an answer, but she also knew something else. She wasn't alone. Lillian had hidden the stones, but she'd left a trail, not for greed, but for someone who would care enough to follow it. And Ilara would. Not for the money, but for the truth. That night she buried the box again, deeper this time under a new floorboard she'd reinforced herself. Then she sat by the fire, sketching not imaginary worlds but real ones. A woman with short hair and steady eyes, standing on a train platform in 1946, handing a velvet pouch to a stranger, a network of quiet heroes. A legacy hidden in plain sight. The stones were worth millions. But their real value? That couldn't be counted in dollars, it was measured in courage. In silence. In the choice to protect instead of profit. And Ilara had just made her choice too. The man in the black car didn't come back, but his shadow lingered. Ilara found herself glancing over her shoulder when she walked to the spring for water. She double-checked the cabin door at night, not out of fear exactly, but because she now understood something she hadn't before. Secrets have weight. And once you carry one, others will try to take it from you. Still, she couldn't stop digging, not now, not when she was so close. She spent the next week poring over every scrap of paper she could find, old tax records, church bulletins, faded photographs in the County Historical Society. She learned that Lillian Crow hadn't just been an heiress. She'd been quietly radical. While her family hosted galas in Lexington, she'd been writing checks to underground newspapers, funding legal aid for displaced families, and, most intriguingly, corresponding with a group called the Harbor Circle, a loose network of safe houses that helped people escape persecution during the late 1930s and early 1940s, but the real breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A box of donated books at the Harlow Library. Tucked inside a 1941 edition of The Grapes of Wrath was a handwritten note, folded so many times it nearly crumbled. It read, "If you're reading this, you've found the truth. Don't let it die." Here Ilara's hands shook. Eleanor Reeves, she'd been real. And she'd left a trail, not for fame, but for someone who would care enough to follow it. She took the note to Mrs. Darnell, who'd lived in Harlow her whole life and knew everyone's grandmother's secrets. Over sweet tea on the porch, Ilara showed her the note, the list of names, the symbols. Mrs. Darnell's eyes widened. Eleanor Reeves. I remember my mama talking about her. Said she taught music at the girls' school before the war. Quiet woman. Always wore a silver locket. Disappeared one winter, just packed a bag and left. Folks said she ran off with a man, but Mama always said no, she ran off to do what was right. Do you know where she went? Ilara asked. Mrs. Darnell shook her head. But I know who might. She reached for her phone and dialed a number from memory. You need to talk to Miriam. She's Lillian's great niece. Lives out in Oregon now, but she's been trying to piece together the family history for years. Never got far. Too many doors slammed in her face. 2 days later, Ilara was on a video call with a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled into a messy bun. Miriam Crow spoke softly, like someone used to being careful with words. I've been looking for those stones for 20 years, she said, her voice thick with emotion, not to sell them, to honor them. She explained that after the Crow Empire fell, the family scattered, ashamed and broken. Most refused to talk about Lillian. But Miriam's grandmother, Lillian's younger sister, had kept a locked diary. In it, she wrote that Lillian hadn't stolen the gems. She'd saved them. During the war, Miriam said, Lillian and Eleanor used the family's connections to move people out of Europe. Jewish families, political dissidents, artists marked by the regime. They couldn't use bank accounts. Everything was watched. So they converted assets into portable wealth. Uncut gems, gold coins, rare stamps. The stones you found? They were the last reserve, meant to fund new lives if the network needed it. But why hide them here? Ilara asked. Because by 1947 it was too dangerous to keep moving them. The government was investigating unexplained wealth. Lillian feared the stones would be seized or worse, used as evidence against the people she'd helped. So she buried them. Not as treasure, but as insurance. In case the world ever needed saving again. Ilara sat in silence, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. These weren't just rocks. They were lifelines. Each one represented a person who'd escaped, a family that survived, a future that existed because someone like Lillian had been brave enough to act in the dark. Miriam leaned closer to the screen. I've tried to find the cabin for years. Otis Claymore's name kept coming up, but he never answered letters. I thought the trail was cold. He gave it to me, Alara said softly, for $500. And he left a note saying the stones weren't mine to sell but to understand. Miriam smiled through tears. Then he knew. He was protecting Lillian's legacy all along. They talked for hours, about history, about silence, about how some acts of courage are never recorded, only felt in the lives they change. Before they hung up, Miriam made a request. If you're willing, I'd like to come see them. Not to take them, just to witness them. To say thank you to Lillian, in the place she chose to guard them. Alara agreed. While she waited for Miriam's visit, the outside world began to press in. Word of the mystery gems had leaked, maybe from Walter the jeweler, maybe from the man in the black car. A local reporter called, then a historian from the State Museum, then a representative from a private auction house. Offers poured in $3 million, $5 million. One anonymous bidder promised $10 million if she'd sign a non-disclosure agreement and disappear. Each time Alara said no, but it wasn't easy. She lay awake at night imagining what that money could do. Pay off her student loans, buy land for a real home, travel, create art without worrying about bills. She wasn't rich. She wasn't even comfortable, and yet every time she thought about selling, she pictured Lillian kneeling on this very floor, placing the box beneath the boards with tears in her eyes, not for herself, but for strangers she'd never meet. How could she betray that? Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sentence typed on old-fashioned paper. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Be careful who you let in. No signature. But she knew. Otis, he was watching, or at least he was still part of this story. Miriam arrived on a crisp autumn morning, her rental car kicking up dust as it rolled down the gravel road. She stepped out wearing hiking boots and a wool coat, carrying a worn leather satchel. She didn't say much at first, just stood in front of the cabin breathing deeply as if the air itself held memories. This is it, she whispered. This is where she stayed. Alara showed her inside. They sat by the fire and Alara carefully pulled up the floorboard again. This time she didn't just show the stones. She told the whole story. The rattle in the night. Otis's cryptic warning, the list of names, the symbols. The pocket watch. Miriam listened without interrupting. When Alara finished, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small framed photograph. It showed two women standing on a garden path, Lillian, tall and sharp-eyed in a tailored suit, and Eleanor, softer, holding a violin case, smiling like she knew a beautiful secret. My grandmother kept this hidden for decades, Miriam said. She said they were inseparable, that Eleanor wasn't just Lillian's partner, she was her compass. She also brought letters, dozens of them tied with ribbon. Written between 1938 and 1946, they spoke of coded messages, midnight train rides, forged papers, and quiet acts of defiance. In one, Lillian wrote, "Today a family of 5 crossed into Switzerland. The youngest is 3. She clutched a stuffed rabbit the whole way. I gave her one of the blue stones to hold, just for luck. She called it her sky jewel. I hope she keeps it. The world needs more sky jewels." Alara cried then, not from sadness but from awe. These women hadn't just hidden wealth. They'd built hope one life at a time. That evening, as they ate soup by lantern light, Miriam made a proposal. The Holocaust Education Foundation has been trying to create a traveling exhibit on civilian resistance during the war, she said. Most stories focus on Europe. But there were networks here too, quiet, undocumented, heroic. If we donated the stones, they could tell Lillian and Eleanor's story. And the proceeds, we could use them to fund something Lillian would have loved. Like what? Alara asked. Affordable housing for artists and activists in rural communities. Places where people can create, heal, and plan for a better world, just like this cabin. Alara looked around the room, the patched walls, the solar lights, the cot where she'd first heard the rattle under the floor. This place had saved her too. What if we built more of them? She said slowly. Right here. A little village. For people who need a fresh start. Miriam's eyes lit up. Crow's Haven. They stayed up late that night, sketching ideas on napkins, dreaming out loud. It wasn't just about the stones anymore. It was about continuing the work. But before they could act, Alara had one more thing to do. She drove to the county clerk's office and filed a legal declaration. The gemstones were not for sale. They were to be held in trust with Miriam as co-custodian until a formal donation could be arranged with the foundation. As she signed the papers, she felt a strange peace. She wasn't giving up the treasure. She was returning it to history, to justice, to the future. That night, back at the cabin, she placed the stones back in their box, but this time, she didn't bury them right away. She let them sit on the table, glowing in the firelight as if saying goodbye. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere far off, an owl called. And for the first time, Alara didn't feel like a stranger in this place. She felt like a keeper, a link in a chain of quiet courage that stretched from 1947 to today and beyond. The real treasure wasn't the stones. It was the choice to protect what matters, even when no one's watching, and she'd just made hers. The morning after filing the legal papers, Alara woke to the sound of tires crunching on gravel. She peered through the cabin window and saw a white van with the logo of a regional news station parked near the spring. Two people stood by the road, one holding a camera, the other flipping through a notepad. Her stomach dropped. Someone had talked. She didn't answer the door. Instead, she slipped out the back, hiking deep into the woods until the cabin was out of sight. She sat beneath a hickory tree, heart pounding, wondering how everything had gotten so loud so fast. She had only wanted to do the right thing, not become a headline. By afternoon, the reporters were gone, but the damage was done. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Calls from unknown numbers, messages from strangers asking if the $500 cabin gem story was real. Even a voicemail from a reality TV producer offering her a life-changing opportunity. She turned the phone off and buried it in her duffel bag. Miriam called that evening from Oregon, her voice tight with concern. "They're calling me too," she said. "A museum in New York wants first dibs. A documentary team is offering 6 figures for exclusive rights. Alara, are you okay?" "I don't want any of it," Alara replied, her voice quiet but firm. "This isn't entertainment. It's history. It's people's lives." "I know," Miriam said gently, "and that's why we have to move fast before someone tries to take it from us." They decided to act. Within days, Miriam flew back, this time with a lawyer who specialized in cultural heritage law. Together, they met with the Holocaust Education Foundation, a small but respected nonprofit based in Cincinnati. The director, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Lynn Tran, listened to their story without interruption, her eyes never leaving the velvet pouch as Alara carefully laid out the stones on a velvet cloth in the foundation's conference room. When Alara finished speaking, Dr. Tran removed her glasses and wiped her eyes. "These aren't just gems," she said. "They're evidence of resistance, of love in the face of hate. We'd be honored to steward them." The plan came together quickly. The stones would be authenticated by independent gemologists and historians, then featured in a traveling exhibit titled Hidden Light, Courage in the Shadows. The exhibit would focus not on the monetary value, but on the network Lillian and Eleanor helped build, highlighting letters, forged documents, and survivor testimonies. All proceeds from the exhibit would fund a new initiative, Crow's Haven, a pilot program to build tiny homes for artists, educators, and community organizers in rural areas who couldn't afford traditional housing. Alara insisted on one condition: no sensationalism, no mystery heiress headlines, no dramatized reenactments, just truth told with care. The foundation agreed, but not everyone was happy. A week later, a certified letter arrived. It was from a law firm representing a private client, claiming ancestral rights to the Crow estate. The letter argued that the gems were stolen property and demanded their immediate return, or legal action would follow. Miriam wasn't surprised. "There's always a cousin twice removed who shows up when money's involved," she said dryly. But this one was different. The claimant was a man named Victor Crow, Lillian's second cousin once removed, a real estate developer from Nashville who'd never shown interest in family history until now. "He's not after justice," Miriam said. "He's after a tax write-off or a flashy auction. He doesn't even know who Lillian was." Still, they had to respond. Their lawyer filed a counter-declaration. citing Lillian's documented humanitarian work, the historical context of the war, and the fact that Victor's branch of the family had publicly disowned Lillian in 1946. The court would decide. But for now, the stones remained in escrow with the foundation. In the meantime, Ilara returned to the cabin exhausted but determined. She needed to ground herself, to remember why she'd said no to millions in the first place. She spent her days clearing brush behind the cabin, marking out plots for future tiny homes. She sketched designs on scrap paper, solar panels, composting toilets, shared gardens. She imagined a potter working at a wheel on one porch, a poet typing on another, a teacher hosting story hours under the oak tree. It wouldn't be fancy, but it would be safe. It would be kind. One evening, as she hammered a post into the ground, she heard a familiar engine rumble down the road. She turned, and there was Otis Claymore, stepping out of a beat-up pickup truck, his coat buttoned against the chill. He didn't say hello. Just walked over, looked at her half-finished post, and grunted. "You're doing it wrong." Needs to go deeper. Frost'll heave it come winter. Then he pulled a shovel from his truck and started digging. They worked in silence for an hour, Otis steady and sure, Ilara following his lead. When the post was set, he wiped his hands on his jeans and finally spoke. "Heard you turned down 10 million, I did." "Smart," he said. "Money like that. It don't bring peace. It brings vultures," Ilara nodded. "I just want to honor what she left behind." Otis looked toward the cabin, his eyes distant. "My grandma, Cora, she worked for Lillian for 20 years. Not as a servant. As a friend. When the world turned on Lillian, Cora was one of the few who stayed. Helped her build this place with her own hands," said Lillian cried the night she buried that box, not because she was losing it, but because she hoped someone worthy would find it someday. He turned to Ilara. "You're worthy." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. "Thank you." He handed her a small oil-stained envelope. "Found this in the attic last week. Meant to give it to you sooner." Inside was a faded photograph. It showed Lillian and Eleanor standing in front of the cabin, still new, its paint-fresh wildflowers blooming at their feet. On the back in Lillian's handwriting, "Home is not a place. It's a promise." Otis left without another word, but the weight he'd carried for decades seemed lighter now. Over the next few weeks, something shifted. The media frenzy died down when no dramatic auction happened. Victor Crow's lawsuit stalled when historians presented evidence that Lillian had legally liquidated family assets to fund humanitarian efforts, a fact buried in old court transcripts. And slowly, quietly, people began to show up, not with cameras but with questions. A young ceramicist from West Virginia emailed, asking if Crow's Haven was real. A retired teacher offered to donate lumber. A nonprofit that builds sustainable housing reached out, wanting to partner. Ilara said yes to all of them. She also received a call from the jeweler, Walter. "I've been thinking," he said. "Those stones, they shouldn't be locked in a vault. What if we made replicas, exact copies but glass, for the exhibit? So people can hold them, feel their weight, understand their story without risking the originals." It was a brilliant idea. Ilara agreed. Then came the day the gemologists finished their report. The stones were authenticated beyond doubt. Kashmir sapphire, Burmese ruby, Colombian emerald, all from mines closed before 1950. Their combined market value? Over $8 million, but the report ended with a note. These items possess immeasurable historical and ethical value that far exceeds their commercial worth. When the news broke, it wasn't with fanfare, it was with reverence. A small article in a national history magazine. A segment on a public radio show. Teachers began requesting the exhibit for their schools, and through it all, Ilara kept building. One afternoon, as she painted the first tiny home's door a soft sky blue, Miriam arrived with a surprise, a young woman named Tessa, a violinist from Chicago who'd fled an abusive relationship with nothing but her instrument and a backpack. She'd heard about Crow's Haven online. "This is really happening?" Tessa asked, her voice trembling as she looked at the cabin, the cleared land, the garden beds already sprouting greens. "It is," Ilara said, handing her a key. "Welcome home." That night they sat around a fire, Ilara, Miriam, Tessa, and 2 volunteers from the housing nonprofit. Tessa played a quiet melody on her violin, the notes rising into the starlit sky like prayers. No one spoke. They didn't need to. In that moment, Alara understood what Lillian must have felt all those years ago. Not fear, but faith. Faith that someone would come after her. Faith that the light she'd hidden would one day be found. Not for profit, but for purpose. The real worth of the stones wasn't in their sparkle. It was in the lives they would help rebuild. And as the fire crackled and the music swirled through the trees, Alara knew she hadn't just uncovered a secret. She'd become part of a legacy, one built not on wealth, but on the quiet, stubborn belief that the world can be kinder if someone's willing to dig for it. 2 years after, Alara first pulled up to the crooked little cabin with nothing but a duffel bag and $500 in her pocket. The hillside behind it looked like a dream stitched together with wood, wire, and hope. 4 tiny homes now stood in a gentle arc around a shared courtyard, each one different, painted in soft blues, warm ochres, mossy greens, but all built with the same care, the same quiet intention. Solar panels glinted on every roof. A communal kitchen with a wood-fired oven sat at the center, its chimney puffing sweet-smelling smoke into the crisp morning air. Wildflowers bordered the paths, and a young apple tree, planted by Tessa on her first full day, was already budding with promise. Life at Crow's Haven wasn't perfect. There were leaks during heavy rains, disagreements about chore rotations, nights when the generator sputtered and someone had to walk 2 miles to borrow a part. But it was real, and it was theirs. Alara still lived in the original cabin. She'd added a proper bathroom, patched the last of the roof, and finally replaced the metal cot with a real bed. But she kept the floorboard near the fireplace loose just in case. Not because she expected to find anything else, but because it reminded her. Some things are meant to be uncovered slowly, with respect. The gemstones were gone now, not lost, but given. They'd been formally donated to the Holocaust Education Foundation and were currently on display in a museum in Chicago as part of the Hidden Light exhibit. The glass replicas Walter made sat in a small case in the Haven's common room, where visitors could hold them, read Lillian and Eleanor's letters, and learn about the quiet network that helped strangers survive one of history's darkest chapters. Already, the exhibit had traveled to 12 cities. School groups wrote thank you notes. Survivors' grandchildren shared stories their families had never spoken aloud. And from every ticket sold, every donation made, funds flowed back to Crow's Haven, enough to break ground on a 5th home and start a micro-grant program for rural artists. Alara never took a salary. She still did freelance illustration work, mostly children's books about kindness, courage, and hidden doors that lead to new beginnings. Her latest project featured a girl who finds a box under her floor filled not with gold, but with seeds, and plants a forest that shelters an entire village. Her editor said it was her best work yet. Alara just smiled. She knew where the story came from. One spring morning, as she sipped coffee on her porch, a postcard fluttered from the mailbox. It was plain, no return address, just a photo of snow-capped mountains and 2 words written in shaky script. Well done. She didn't need to guess who sent it. Otis hadn't been back since that day he helped her set the post, but she knew he was watching. Maybe from Alaska. Maybe from a quiet town she'd never heard of. Wherever he was, he'd seen what she'd built, and approved. She pinned the postcard to the wall beside the photograph of Lillian and Eleanor, now framed in reclaimed wood from the cabin's original porch. Sometimes when the light hit just right, it looked like they were smiling. Miriam visited often, usually with a new batch of letters or photographs she'd uncovered in old attics and estate sales. On her last trip, she brought a small wooden box lined with velvet. Inside was Lillian's pocket watch, the one Alara had found in the metal box, now repaired, its hands ticking softly again. The foundation had it restored, Miriam said. They wanted you to have it. Said it belonged here. Alara held it to her ear, listening to the steady rhythm. 3:17, the time it had been frozen for decades. Now it moved, just like the story. That summer, Crow's Haven hosted its first community open house. Neighbors from miles around came, farmers, teachers, teenagers with sketchbooks and guitars. There was music, bread baked in the outdoor oven, and a reading of letters from the Harbor Circle archive. Tessa played a piece she'd composed called Sky Jewel, inspired by the note Lillian wrote about the 3-year-old girl who'd clutched a sapphire like a talisman. Afterward, An elderly woman approached Ilara, tears in her eyes. "My father escaped Vienna in 1939, she said quietly. He never talked about how. But last week I found a faded receipt in his old coat. Payment to a L. Crow Harlow KY. I didn't know what it meant. Until today." Ilara hugged her, and in that moment the past and present folded together like pages in a well-loved book. Not everything had worked out neatly. Victor Crow's lawsuit had eventually been dismissed, but not before it cost time, money, and sleepless nights. The man in the black car never returned, but Ilara still locked her door at night, not out of fear but habit. And sometimes, when the wind howled through the pines, she still heard that faint rattle under the floor, though she knew it was just memory now, not metal. But the good outweighed the hard. Every morning, she woke to the sound of laughter from the next cabin over. Every evening they gathered to share meals and stories. No one was rich, no one was famous, but everyone belonged. One afternoon, while weeding the community garden, Ilara found a smooth river stone tucked among the tomato plants. Carved into it in careful letters was a single word: remember. She didn't know who left it. Tessa, maybe, or one of the new residents, a poet named Juniper who'd arrived last fall with a typewriter and a heart full of grief. It didn't matter. The message was clear. Remember the courage. Remember the silence. Remember that sometimes the most powerful acts happen in the shadows, with no audience, no reward, just a choice to do what's right. That night, as fireflies blinked in the tall grass, Ilara sat on her porch with her sketchbook. She wasn't drawing fantasy worlds anymore. She was documenting this one, the way the light hit the apple tree at dusk, the curve of the shared roofline, the hands of her neighbors as they kneaded dough or strummed strings. She called the series, "What Grows from Hidden Things." She didn't know if anyone beyond the hillside would ever see it. And that was okay, because the real story wasn't about a $500 cabin or $1,000,000 gems. It was about what happened after the discovery. How one woman's choice to honor a secret sparked a chain of kindness that kept growing, like roots under the soil, unseen but strong. The world kept spinning, loud and fast and full of noise. But here on this quiet patch of Kentucky hillside, something slower and deeper was taking hold. A place where broken people could mend, where forgotten histories could breathe again, where a floorboard wasn't just wood, it was a threshold. And Ilara, she wasn't just the woman who found the treasure, she was the one who decided it wasn't hers to keep, but hers to pass on. Years later, when school children visited Crow's Haven as part of the Hidden Light education tour, they'd ask her the same question: what would you have done if you'd sold the stones? She'd smile, pour them lemonade from a mason jar and say, "I don't know, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." Because in the end, the real worth wasn't measured in carrots or cash. It was measured in the lives changed. The songs played, the seeds planted, the doors left open. And as the sun dipped below the ridge, painting the sky in streaks of rose and gold, Ilara knew. She hadn't just bought a home for $500. She'd inherited a promise, and she was keeping it, one quiet day at a time.